are resilient. We're still here, and hopefully we can continue that way. First of all, I'd like to thank our supporters, the Dairy Strong Sustainability Alliance, the Nature Conservancy, the Wisconsin Department of Ag, Trade and Consumer Protection, Ag Source, St. Croix County Farm Bureau, and Hub International. And I'd like to just introduce our board members. First of all, my name is Todd Dornick. I'm the president. Tom Zwald is our treasurer. Chris Van Zomeren is our secretary. Greg Frenshu, Jerry Emmerich, Jeff Luck, Larry Knudsen, and Leslie Savinka, who's actually this is her last year on our board, and so I'd like to thank her for her time and commitment. And we will be electing board members during the annual meeting later on today. And so, again, the Western Wisconsin Conservation Council is a group of farmers committed to being stewards of the land and water in our care. We use research, collaboration, and financial resources to promote farming's best practices to keep soil healthy and water clean. Our aim is to bring benefit to the whole community while preserving farming as a way of our life. So our core values is to make sure that we make a personal commitment to implement innovative best practices. We connect with the community and have a tireless focus on scientific testing, measuring of results, and showing outcomes and experiences. I'd like to provide a little update what the WWCC has done since 2018. Our farmer connections are key to our efforts. Members encourage and empower each other to tailor practices for their individual farms and, importantly, to share experiences and outcomes with one another. The initiative is about results. Partnering with Wisconsin University of Wisconsin River Falls, we use scientific methods to guide our work, measure its progress, and develop and prioritize our programs. Currently, we have 49 members of all types. We focus on the Kinnickinnick, Rush, and Willow River watersheds. Our basic membership is pretty easy. You have to complete a survey, and if you haven't had a chance to do that today, please do it, because it's based on it's needed for our cost sharing dollars that we get from DADCAP. So it's very important that we fill those out. Our other membership requirements is that you participate in our no-cost well testing program. That's where we're getting our base science for our watershed to give us an idea where the nitrates might be, and we'll get a follow-up from Dr. Jill here later tonight. The other thing about members is you can attend our events and share your ideas. If members do this, we have a nice cost share program that you can participate in. That's all you need to do. This past year, we received grants from DATCAP and the Nature Conservancy to execute our programs for this year. Part of the program has been continuing our research partnership with River Falls, which we'll get an update later, like I said, from Dr. Jill. Because of rising concerns about nitrates and groundwater in our community, we wanted to focus on what we could do as farmers to help. Grant money helps support well testing for the WWCC to establish a baseline in groundwater over a large sample. And like I mentioned before, UW River Falls does all the testing, and the specific results shared only with the well owner and the aggregate with the group. The other things that the WWCC has done this year is held a field day on November 11th, focusing on grass waterways, and we've had speakers from the DNR and the St. Croix County staff and WWCC board members. The event helped get the word out about our group and was a great opportunity for members to share their successes and network with new farmers. Third year, another milestone for us is our third year of conservation practice survey. If you haven't completed it, like I mentioned before, please get that done. It helps us track conservation practices implemented for our members, allowing us to measure the change in acres and practices over time and demonstrate progress on environmental outcomes. We've had a second year of our cost share program, including cover crops, reduced till, no-till, and 4R nutrient management. Awarding cost sharing to 23 members this year. That's an increase from 16 last year, and we hope to continue to increase funds available for the program in 2021. WWC was quoted and mentioned in media through the year, included in 30 stories, potential audience reach of 330,000 people. And in our Facebook, we had 135 likes, and that's 785 people actually stopped and read a post. So we're making great progress that way on our social aspect, and we're growing our media presence through our Facebook page. Be sure to like us on there. And then we've also applied for a 2021 DATCAP grant, and we received $30,000 this year. Another summer field day this year and another annual meeting to continue, and we also plan to continue to promote conservation practices to local farmers through events and cost share program. We want your feedback and input, so please tell us what you'd like to see in 2021. Time for this is during our annual business meeting, which will be right after this. We have a new cost share opportunity thanks to the support of the Nature Conservancy, with more details to be shared later in the meeting. And we have received a grant from DATCAP for nutrient management planning. More details to follow as well. So again, thanks for joining us today, and hopefully we'll have an open discussion, and thanks for your participation. So at this time, I'd like to hand it over to Steve, and he from the Nature Conservancy, and he can take the program from here.
Okay. Well, again, I'm Steve Richter, and I work for the Nature Conservancy in the state of Wisconsin, and my role with the nonprofit is working with on agricultural projects, such as an example, the one today working with you all. And as this slide illustrates, our primary role, which Todd alluded to, is providing financial support for cost share programs or other activities the group has done for the past 3 years. And we, as I think will be illustrated in the following slides, we're really happy with the outcomes your organization is putting forward. I also try to help out by providing some advice or ideas, and putting together the annual conservation survey, and the presentation tonight is an example of that. Next slide, Jamie. So the next slide illustrates, and again, I apologize for the small font. I put this together this morning because it illustrates the tally of the conservation survey from 2020, with which 46 of the farmers in your organization filled out this year. And I was busy this morning sort of tallying up the figures that are on this slide. And in doing so, I compare those to the figures from 2019, which are on the left-hand side of this slide. And I've taken a subset of the conservation practices that were on that survey, and have put them on the slide. And so these practices are examples. Some of the practices tied to fertilizing, variable rate nitrogen stabilizers, nutrient management planning. Then I turn to practices like cover crops, reduced tillage, no-till, and finally, on the bottom of the slide, talk about some of the edge of field practices like grass waterways. And some of the highlights, again, for those who can't see the small font or who are on the phone, is that 46 farmers out of 47 completed the survey this year. That's up from 30 farmers that did it in 2019, and 11 farmers did it in 2018. So the growth of your group is great, year after year. It's pretty amazing. from those 46 farmers farming 44,000 acres of land and 14,000 dairy cows and about 750 beef cattle. These numbers are up from 2019, where 30 members filled out the survey. Just to kind of highlight some of the practices, about half of the 46 members, 23, are doing cover crops, and that totaled about 10,800 acres. Fewer farmers in your group are doing reduced tillage, 17 of the 46 members, and a similar number, 17 other members, are doing no-till farming. So 34 of the members in total are doing some type of conservation tillage, either strip tillage, half, or the other half doing no-till. And acre-wise, that totals up to about 20,000 acres. So hats off to all of you for putting so much reduced tillage, on your farms or in the watersheds. And what these, again, there's other numbers on here. Nutrient management planning again is way up there, 33,000 acres. 2/3 of that is done by a qualified crop advisor, but a third of you, 12 of the 46 are probably qualified to write a nutrient management plan, and you're doing it for your farm. So I guess one question I get is year after year, will these numbers have to keep going up and up and up? And I say they don't have to. It really depends on the purpose, the goals of the group. The goals might not be let's increase our membership year after year after year, but rather let's keep our membership and let's work on setting outcome measures or looking at other ways of increasing our presence through educational activities. Next slide, Jamie. And this next slide is giving an introduction into another type of analysis that I'll be describing using the numbers from the survey. And that's using the software tool that's utilized to do your nutrient management plans. And one of the outcomes from that nutrient management planning software is an example is the Wisconsin Phosphorus Index. And that's a measure via modeling from a lot of different factors, both external and internal to your operation, to really get a sense of environmental impacts from your practices on your farm. And the P index, as is noted on the slide, is trying to illustrate how much pounds of phosphorus per acre per year is being delivered off of your field into the nearest surface water body, usually a stream or a river. And so ideally, we want the phosphorus index value to be very low. And the lower numbers would then recognize that you're keeping soil in place on your farm fields and you're keeping fertilizer such as manure or commercial fertilizer in place too from running off either as dissolved or particulate matter. So to create a nutrient management plan, next slide, Jamie. This slide is illustrating all of the components that go into a nutrient management plan. And what we do in these farmer-led groups is we take county-wide or averages for all of the values on the left-hand side of the slide in terms of, in other words, we don't have the nutrient management plans for every single farm of, say, the 46 farmers who returned the survey. We don't have all those plans to kind of create outcome measures of soil loss or phosphorus loss off fields on your farms, but rather we average or take county-wide estimates of things like what are the most prevalent crop rotations in your farmer-led group? What's an estimate of the manure that's being applied to fields in your group? Estimates of countywide estimates of soil type, county estimates of how much field in Class C slopes, steeper slopes versus Class A slopes, which more are flatter land. Are you using contours or not, et cetera, et cetera. So we've taken a lot of, we've gotten a lot of information from members in your group to sort of come up with those averages. And from that, then we're able to make some, estimates of what kind of impact you are having in terms of surface runoff from your fields. Next slide, Jamie. Slide is a reminder to me to note that the crop rotations that are most common of the farm members of your group are dairy corn silage rotation, dairy corn silage with alfalfa. Third is continuous corn, and fourth is corn soybeans rotation. And the two practices, well, we honed in on three practices. One was cover crops. What are the impact of cover crops? Two, what are the impacts of reduced tillage? And three, what is the impact of low disturbance manure injection? Next slide, Jamie. And this next slide is another table. And it's a table that is illustrating that if you were a dairy farmer and had a corn silage rotation with no alfalfa in the rotation, here are some percent reductions and also soil loss reductions in tons of soil per acre per year with a variety of conservation practices. So just I'll walk through this a bit. The first row on the slide is sort of conventional practices. In other words, without any reduced tillage, without any cover crops, without low disturbance manure injection. Those would be the soil loss values in tons per acre per year on various slopes. Again, the CD slopes are the steeper slopes of 6% grade or higher. And so those slopes have the greater figure, 14 tons per acre per year is eroding off of a slope like that if you aren't using things like reduced tillage or cover crops, etc. On the flatter lands, flatter fields, which I have A slopes with conventional, with again, no conservation practices, your soil loss is about 2.5 tons per acre per year. The following four rows in this on this slide illustrate the really significant reductions in soil loss one could have on a farm. Again, a dairy, this is an example of a dairy farm with corn silage with putting conservation practices in place. So I will just illustrate one line. Let's illustrate a dairy farm using corn silage and using, say, no-till practices with a cover crop, the second line down. You would be reducing the soil loss from those fields by about 70%, depending again on the slope, but a significant reduction in soil by utilizing no-till and cover crops in that example. Now, we literally have these sets of tables for the rotations. I have only illustrating here dairy corn silage, but we have such a table for the other three rotations as well in terms of soil loss. And Jamie, next slide. And this next slide is another chart, and it's another illustration of the impact of conservation practices on surface runoff, in this sense, not soil running off the fields as the last slide, but phosphorus being phosphorus being delivered off the fields. And again, as was this slide telling the same story as the last slide. In this case, it's a cash crop rotation. In other words, corn and soybean in the rotation over a 4-year period of time. And we're looking at p-index values. Again, a p-index value of 4.33 would be our starting point without any conservation practices. And that value, again, is about 4 pounds of phosphorus leaving the field per acre per year without any conservation practices. If one would put, again, no-till and cover crop in the rotation, in other words, all 4 years using no-till planting and putting a cover crop following the harvest of soy or corn in the fall, the p-index would again be significantly reduced. So a lot less phosphorus leaving your fields, staying within the soil, which is really, really key. Again, about 70% reduction in phosphorus. So maybe in summary is for all 4 rotations, and I've only illustrated 2, we fortunately see about a 60 to 70% reduction in surface runoff of soil or phosphorus with good conservation practices that your group is putting in place, as was illustrated on my very first slide of all the great conservation you're doing. Hang on. And so I'm going to then, I've got a phone ringing. Go to the next slide, Jamie. And this slide is then gives us another way of talking about what was shown on those 2 charts. In other words, as illustrated here is we could do these, what I call scenario playing, based on all of the factors that we took to create these SNAP analysis. We can say that if you're a dairy farmer utilizing corn silage and you have a cover crop utilized in the fall, and if you had 715 acres of corn silage and you were putting a cover crop on it, you'd have this great reduction in 1,400 tons of soil. You'd prevent that from leaving your fields, as well as 1,400 pounds of phosphorus leaving your farm. And we can create scenarios just like that for other rotations, whether it's corn, soybean, and or continuous corn, or dairy corn silage with alfalfa. And in all cases, again, it depends on the acres of the field in practice. On this slide, we have illustrations with significant acres being utilized, 715 acres, for example, in the dairy farm rotation. Next slide, Jamie. The third factor that we can create and track through time is an indication of soil health, and that's a soil conditioning index. And what we can track through time with conservation practices is a metric on how your soil health is improving. And with these conservation practices of cover crops, reduced tillage, low disturbance manure injection, we're finding that those fields with such practices are increasing soil carbon, and in turn, increasing soil carbon increases soil organic matter. And as you all are well aware of, better than me, is when you improve soil health, you have all sorts of wonderful benefits that go with it in holding water, holding nutrients, holding carbon, maybe in time reducing fertilizer inputs because your soil has become more healthy. Jamie, finally, the last slide is just a thank you to all of you, farmers or advisors that are on today's call for, you know, making the initiative, being those experimenters, those risk takers to try such practices, and then also to share such knowledge with all of your colleagues or fellow farmers in the area. And in conclusion, what I've presented here is a summary of some of the outcomes. First, a set of just basic participants and acres showing great increase in these practices over the last 3 years, which is wonderful. And that's a wonderful to have that documented. And second, some modeling work based on the nutrient management planning software to give us a sense of what kind of impact your group is having in terms of reducing impacts on surface waters in terms of less soil erosion and less phosphorus erosion. I think the following presentation is going to be talking about groundwater and the impacts of nitrates on groundwater, and possibly in the years to come, you'll be looking at more of metrics to track that, as well as keeping these metrics that we're doing that I've shared with you in terms of the impacts on surface waters. So thank you all. And I look forward to listening to Jill's presentation, and then after that, probably open for questions.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about the well testing program again, and also to give you an update on, I suppose it's some exciting news that I haven't gotten to communicate to the group yet. So except for a few individuals. So of course, everything's been put on hold because of COVID. But we'll kind of talk about a few different things. I wanted to make sure that I reviewed some things that I talked about at the last annual meeting, just in case there are a few new members who didn't see that information before. So for those of you who have seen this, yes, I kind of stole a little bit from my last presentation to the group, but I really wanted to make sure that any new members that are with us tonight have that same background that those folks who were at the meeting last year do. So with that, I need to say that there is no way that I could have any of this information to share with you without the assistance of my colleague Heather Sumner Davis, who is the lab manager for my department at the university, and then of course my wonderful students. Leslie was back again with us this year. She is this wonderful storehouse of information now about the project. And then Zach Anerud joined her this year for testing, and he's been also a wonderful addition to the project. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is again information that, you know, if you are new to the group and you didn't see the presentation from last year, you know, the well testing program is based on this interest in what's happening with nitrate levels in our groundwater in the region. And so in many regions across the United States, we're seeing nitrate levels increase in the groundwater, and our region is really no different. And there are, you know, it's a personal thing, it's a business issue, it's a community issue. And we know from research that land use activities can have a really significant impact on the nitrate levels that we measure in groundwater. There are a lot of other factors that also come into play, things like, you know, what your soils are like and how you know, how deep, you know, how the depth of the soil profile, how deep to bedrock, where the water table kind of sits in there. And then we also know that there are short-term effects and long-term effects, you know, for different land use activities on groundwater. And one of the questions I think that we're eventually working towards with this project is, can we have some control over the trends that we see in nitrate levels in our groundwater? Can we, you know, we've seen things increase. Is there a way for us to work together to kind of turn that around and actually see them decrease? So the sampling effort, you know, we're sampling in areas of Polk, much of St. Croix, and then Pierce counties. In the first year of the project, we sampled between 41 and 45 wells. In the second year of the project, we sampled 59 wells, and then this past year we're up to 88 wells, which is astounding. It's wonderful, and it keeps those students busy, so that's really great too. COVID has ruined everything this year. I just need to put that out there. We had big plans for getting out in the spring and starting, getting those variable wells sampled in the spring, because the testing program, for any member who joins, we sample that well 4 times in the first year, so we can get a sense of what's the variability in nitrate levels in this particular well. And then if that well is not showing a lot of variability and it's really low, then we dial the sampling effort back to once per year. And for those wells that are showing a lot more variability or showing really high results, we sample them more frequently to keep an eye on things. So COVID ruined all of that. It shut down our campus completely. For a while, we didn't have good information about even if we could get back into the lab and have any sort of lab analyses until the pandemic was over. So there was a lot of chaos at the beginning, I would say, as there was in a lot of places. Over the summer, eventually, our emergency operations team, they kind of came together and put some protocols in place so that we could get back to doing some work. So my students restarted in August, and so that's why, we had a January sampling before all of that hit the fan, and then we came back for that August sampling. For those more variable wells, we would have liked to have gone out 2 other times this year, but it just wasn't a possibility, unfortunately. So yeah, I mentioned each well is sampled 4 times in that first year, and then we have just annual sampling for those stable wells. For every sample we collect, we measure pH, temperature, conductivity, which is a measure of dissolved salts in the water, nitrate, and chloride. And then most of our samples, I would say, are collected kind of here in these yellow circles, ovals. So that's kind of where, our samples and our results are then biased towards what the groundwater is doing in those particular areas, right? Because that's where we're doing our sampling. So some updated information for this year. These are just all of the nitrate concentrations for all of the samples that we have collected in this project thus far. We have collected and analyzed 374 samples over the 3 years, and about, what is it, about, I'd say around half of them, around half of them are falling above that health standard. So the health standard is 10 parts per liter in nitrate, and that standard is protective of infants especially. Uh-oh, I'm getting a message about poor call quality, so I apologize if something goes down here. So, those 175 samples, this is kind of showing that break point. That about here is where, about 175 samples fall below that standard, and then the remaining almost 200 samples fall above that health standard. Now, I will say that this data set is biased towards some of those higher values. So please don't take this to mean that like everything is, the story is incredibly bad, because we are sampling those particular wells a little bit more frequently, just to keep an eye on things. So I would say, our results aren't terribly different from what we see in the region from other databases. So this is the Well Water Quality Viewer. I showed this last year as well, just to, again, give those new members a sense of what things look like from another data source. And the yellow areas are areas that kind of indicate higher average levels of nitrate from other testing programs. And you can see that kind of big yellow area in the middle of St. Croix County, which is one of our prime sampling areas as well. And these are just kind of a breakdown of how many of the samples within these different townships are or sections are above the health standard, falling above the health standard. So we are not out of line with what's out there. Again, 53% of these samples are above the standard, but we are a little bit biased towards those higher samples because we're keeping an eye on them. This is a figure showing just the average for every well that's in our data set. Some of them don't actually have averages yet because we've just sampled them once. So those are also included in here just to start to give us a sense of where they fall. I would say that I think some of the newer wells that have come in recently are probably weighting us a little bit more on the lower end of the nitrate concentrations. I think when I presented this figure last year, we had slightly more than half or about half of the wells were above that 10 part per million standard, that average 10 part per million standard. And this year, 48 or 47 of our wells are averaging just below or to well below that 10 part per million or that 10 milligram per liter nitrate standard. So, we still have some wells over here that are, you can see the error bars on these different data points. So what we tend to see is that those wells that have the higher nitrate concentrations also have the most variability in the data set. It's not, there are a couple exceptions. We can see some more variable results down here for a couple wells, but for the most part, it's those wells that are showing higher nitrate concentrations that we're seeing a lot of variability. And, that could be because we're seeing higher values generally in the wells that are in the limestone. Limestone tends to be pretty fractured. And so there could be, there could be some cracks or pipes that are allowing a little bit more connection with the surface, and so more recent water that's maybe got a little more nitrate in it is getting down into those areas a little more quickly. If that were the case, if that interpretation were to hold, then the good news would be that we could also maybe reverse those trends a little bit more quickly. So I think those are wells that are important to keep an eye on. This is an updated figure showing the average nitrate concentration in wells that we found that we were measuring that end in sandstone, so they're really drawing water from a sandstone aquifer, versus wells that are drawing their water from a limestone aquifer. This is not all the wells. I would say we probably know about. We know the bedrock type that about half of our wells are drawing from. But this was really interesting, I think. And I just, it tickles me because I love long-term data. I have loved it ever since I was in grad school, because that's kind of what my project in grad school turned into. But I can't overstate the importance of having a long-term record. If we had been sampling these wells just for even the first year and a half, we would have missed something like this. So I don't yet know exactly what this discrepancy is here between the limestone and the sandstone aquifers. But I can say that, we did have an incredibly wet year in 2018 into 2019. So it may be that that really wet year kind of affected our limestone aquifer a little bit more. I need to dig into the data a little bit more to figure out why this pattern kind of emerged. And then we get into our August sampling of just this year, and those numbers have come back together again. So again, we would not have, if we had just done 1 year of sampling, we would not have seen this trend. It showed up, and I have a suspicion that it's related to weather patterns, right? And weather is an incredibly important variable to be able to address and tease out in your data set, so that you're not making your interpretations of what's happening and what your trends are based on just what the weather is doing. So those are kind of the key updates on the data that I have for you. I would say a lot of our findings remain the same since 2020. We're similar to other well testing programs. We find that the deeper wells tend to have less nitrate for the most part. That we tend to find that when there are more dissolved salts, more dissolved ions, so that higher conductivity value, we see more nitrate. And that chloride and nitrate tend to be positively correlated in general. It's a stronger trend for our limestone wells than for our sandstone wells. Again, maybe showing that connection to some, surface sources. Something new, I would say, maybe the effects of a wet year. We need to dive in on that a little bit more, but that really, I think that's valuable information, that when we have a wet year, what are the, not that we can predict that necessarily in advance, but what are those conservation practices that might be more effective in wet versus dry years? Or, are there practices that we could, that are really effective in wet years that are also effective in drier years that we could be focusing on? So, this is some, again, some review from last year for those new members. Um, there were some, and I bring it back for everyone, in part because I'm trying to set the stage for talking about a research fellowship that I was awarded through the Dairy Innovation Hub this spring, right when COVID hit. So we identified some wells that had higher variability. We have a lot of samples that are falling above the health standard. 95% of the samples are above background levels, so most wells are showing some impact, some elevated nitrate to some degree. In 2019, we did a little pilot study using what are called lysimeters. These are little pieces of equipment that allow us to sample the soil water, so that you pull a suction on them and they can actually suck in some of the water from your moist soils. And so they were useful in 2019 for seeing some of those nitrate trends in soil water. I think one of our concluding thoughts that I keep thinking about, and that my fellowship is going to try and address, are that BMPs for nitrate and groundwater aren't terribly well established. I mean, we know some things that work, but I keep thinking about how much variability there is in the world, and just in our region, and how you can have all of these different factors that come together to affect how much nitrate leaches through that soil profile. And, is there a way that we can put together that information that can really make some specific recommendations for either individual farmers or for farmers that are, on this type of soil, and, using certain, producing certain crops or using certain management practices. So, and just as a quick way to say, some of the things that I was thinking about in 2019 were, those variable wells, again, looking to do more in-depth work with these lysimeters, looking at different cropping practices, and then also trying to get some information about, a little bit more information about the context of the groundwater in different wells, right? So looking more for filling in some of the data gaps that we have in our data set. And the fellowship that I was awarded in the spring through the Dairy Innovation Hub actually builds around those concluding thoughts from 2019. So, the well testing program with WWCC really forms kind of the kernel of this research project. If you're not familiar with the Dairy Innovation Hub, it's a state-funded initiative that is trying to boost Wisconsin's dairy community, right? And by looking at environmental, economic, social factors, advancing science, developing talent, leveraging collaboration, those sorts of things. And the vision of the Dairy Innovation Hub is to be this really preeminent source of bold new discoveries and talent development in dairy. And so this was a nice, opportunity that kind of overlaid with some of the work in the WWCC. So and now we can kind of use it to continue on some of the work that we've started together. And 3 campuses were awarded the funding or are part of the Dairy Innovation Hub. So it's River Falls, UW Platteville, and UW Madison that are participating in the hub. And let's see here. Yeah. So the other kind of strength of the research fellowship is that it aligns really well with some of the recommendations from the Wisconsin Groundwater Coordinating Council. They made priority recommendations to the state legislature in 2019. Those included identifying those areas of the state that are more sensitive to nitrate contamination, assessing the impact of alternative cropping practices on nitrate loss from fields, developing best management practices. So, you know, exactly what we were talking about last year this time in the annual meeting, and then reaching out to stakeholders in the agricultural industry and looking to facilitate on the ground use of research results. So, you know, the work of the WWCC dovetails really nicely with what the Wisconsin Groundwater Coordinating Council has been recommending to the state. So, you know, my goals within the fellowship are to help identify cropping practices that are going to be most effective in reducing the amount of nitrate that leaches from the soil surface towards our aquifers. Assessing some of the long-term impacts of those nutrient management practices. So again, thinking about not just a year or a summer of data, but thinking about, you know, can we get 3 years of data and maybe get past some of the variability that's introduced by weather? Can we determine the hydrogeologic or the basically the context that the groundwater finds itself in within these aquifers for those areas where we're seeing really high nitrate concentrations? And then through study of that, providing some preliminary data about our regional groundwater systems. There is a nice model that was developed by the U.S. Geological Survey several years ago, but they identified some gaps in there. And so it's possible that the data that comes out of this fellowship could be used to refine that model and give us better information how groundwater is moving underneath our feet. And then some of the methods, just so you're aware of these, you know, my idea is to conduct a multi-factor study of nitrate transport. So looking at soils, looking at cropping practices, looking at nutrient management practices, looking at water management practices, using those soil water samplers, those lysimeters again, to kind of figure that out. Doing this over multiple years so we can tease out some of those climatic factors, you know, and get at how is weather influencing our leaching, and then how can those best management practices be attuned to those weather patterns. More focused nitrate monitoring in elevated and variable wells. You know, maybe collecting some samples, not just for nitrate, but also for some of these age markers that are present in groundwater. So there are certain constituents that we analyze in groundwater that can tell us about the relative age of that water, how long it's been underground and isolated from the surface. And then looking into maybe using some probes for more continuous monitoring. We know we have variability in these wells based on sampling 4 times a year. Could we install a continuous monitoring probe that lets us see, is there a really close connection? You know, if we get a rainstorm, do we see a change in nitrate 5 days later, a month later in a particular well? I think that would be really useful information. I don't know that we're going to take questions right now. We got to make sure we have our masks on though. So, so when there is time for questions, I'm happy to answer those. I think I need to turn it back over to Todd at this point for some for our transition.
Yeah,
Well,
Dr. willing to take a
go ahead.
question. We do have one.
Okay.
Josh Camps asked, how does private well construction impact the resulting water quality?
How does private well construction impact water quality? You mean in terms of if an individual is putting down wells, do new wells impact water quality? I don't know that an individual well, I'm not quite a believer in this idea that an individual well significantly impacts groundwater quality. Um, the 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 levels of different contaminants or constituents that we see in groundwater are really a mix of a lot of different signals. You know, it's possible that if you have an individual well that maybe wasn't well sealed and it's not located in a good area where there's a lot of water just kind of running down to it, perhaps then that results in, you know, this surficial connection where you can get water from the surface running right down to that well and entering the groundwater. But I think, you know, most wells need to be well constructed in the first place because people are using them for drinking. And so I think there are fairly high standards for well construction that prevent most cases of surficial contamination that might result from a single well. I could be wrong about that, but that's my sense of things because we need to keep we need to keep those wells clean so that people can use them for drinking water. So I hope that answered your question.
Well, this is Todd. I will thank both of our speakers today. Is there any other questions from the members at all, or anybody else out there? We have a little time for that, correct, Lauren?
Sure, if anyone has any more questions for either Steve, Richter, or Dr. Jill, otherwise I'll pull up my screen for the annual business meeting.
I have one question. Did you do any analysis of how close these wells were to fields that had commercial fertilizer put on them as opposed to raw manure or dairy manure?
We have not done that. That would be a really interesting research question. And I think, you know, since members have pretty good records of those activities, I think there's a possibility to tie that information back. Again, I hesitate a little bit to make really strong conclusions about you know, the results that we see in a single well being directly tied to what's immediately around it. Because again, it's such a mixed system, and I think we have to be really careful about concluding that. But you know, certainly if we have a sense of what the flow paths are, how is that groundwater moving, it might be that rather than looking at a well that's located next to a particular field, if we could have a region or an area that we know is kind of, you know, the land use is kind of upstream of our groundwater flow paths, and we look at the wells that are kind of downstream on those flow paths, you know, that might be a way to tease apart some of this information.
Actually, I think your next project with lysimeters in operating fields would be more beneficial in concluding what happens there.
Yeah, I agree. And I will say, you know, I'm gonna be looking for for volunteers here. So if you have a really strong interest in, you know, I've talked with some folks and have I think I have some folks who would be willing. So, but if you have a particularly strong interest in being involved, send me a message or tell, you know, one of the board members and have them, you know, send me your information, get a hold of me. I'd be happy to talk with you. Mm-hmm.
Hey, Jill, this is Steve Richter.
Yes.
One idea, maybe you could think about adding as part of your study with the Dairy Hub is getting as many of these members and working with them to track nutrient use efficiency of the fertilizer and manure they're putting down, and that could be as simple as yield of crop over pounds of fertilizer and pounds of manure. There are a few other more detailed calculations that don't take a lot of extra work, but that could provide, and then there are benchmarks for such figures, and it could provide the members something that each of them can be striving for, and then through time, again 3-5 years, seeing what if scenarios are happening to into the groundwater well data you're getting based on ideally improvements in nutrient use efficiency over a set of 10, 20, 30 or more of the farmers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a wonderful idea. I'm still, frankly, I am in survival mode right now. Because like a lot of folks, my kids are distance learning and I'm trying to make my full-time professional job work, as is my husband. And so um, we're surviving this stuff. So I feel like I'm behind on some of the planning process. I'm making some decisions about, different equipment that I'd like to use and some of the different factors that I'd like to look at initially. But yeah, I'm open to different ideas. There's still time to design some of these questions, the more specific questions. Yeah. So.